Judge Martin Hayes sat at the front of his courtroom, a place he had been in countless times before. The cold, hard formality of it all was comforting to him. The air was thick with the usual mixture of nervous tension and resignation as defendants stood before him, pleading their cases or accepting their fates. He ran a tight ship. Every case, from the minor violations to the more serious offenses, was handled with unwavering attention to procedure. The rules were clear, and he followed them to the letter. Maria Johnson entered the room just after the call for the next case. She was a woman in her early 40s, with a poised, quiet confidence. Her dark eyes were calm, betraying none of the usual anxiety that filled the faces of others in the same position. She wore a neat blazer and slacks, her appearance professional yet understated. As she stood before Judge Hayes, she gave a small nod in greeting, a polite but distant acknowledgement. Judge Hayes glanced at the paperwork before him, his eyes flicking between the case details and the woman standing before him. Maria Johnson, he read aloud, charged with parking in a restricted area. He looked up at her, expecting the usual defensive mumble or attempt to explain away the infraction. Maria met his gaze, her expression soft but steady. "Your Honor, I was parked briefly while assisting a family member who had a medical emergency," she explained calmly. "It was a momentary stop, and I had no choice but to park there. I was only in the area for a few minutes." The judge's gaze never wavered as he took in her words. He had heard similar explanations many times before, and they rarely changed his ruling. The law was the law, and violations were violations. His job was to maintain order, not to let personal stories cloud the process. "I understand your explanation, Ms. Johnson," Judge Hayes replied evenly. "However, this is a clear violation of the parking regulations. The law doesn't make exceptions for circumstances. I'm afraid I'll have to impose the fine." Maria nodded in acceptance, her face betraying no sign of frustration. It was almost as if the ruling didn't faze her at all. She didn't argue or beg for leniency. Instead, she simply stepped forward to sign the paperwork, her signature neat and deliberate. As she handed the papers back to the clerk, she offered Judge Hayes a brief, composed smile. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth, but with a quiet strength that lingered in the air. Without another word, Maria turned and exited the courtroom, leaving behind a room full of people, none of whom seemed to know that the woman who had just been fined was someone who had impacted the lives of millions with her work. Judge Hayes, though, simply moved on to the next case, unaware of the ripple that would soon grow from this seemingly insignificant moment. Maria Johnson left the courthouse with a quiet resolve, the weight of the fine a mere inconvenience in her day. It was the kind of thing she had encountered countless times before, small battles in a much larger war. But what she didn't anticipate was the ripple effect that would soon follow, triggered by something as trivial as a parking violation. It all started with a single post on social media. Maria's friend, Carla, had been waiting outside the courthouse for her, as they often did after such mundane hearings. As soon as Maria exited, Carla could sense that something was off. Maria didn't look upset, but there was a certain weariness in her eyes that suggested this wasn't just about a fine. She had been to countless courtrooms, faced even more battles, but this one felt different. Carla couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on beneath the surface. With a few taps on her phone, Carla shared a photo of Maria walking away from the courthouse, her expression unreadable. The caption read, "Just witnessed a local journalist, a woman who has spent her life fighting for justice, get fined for a parking violation. Something isn't right here. #JusticeForMaria." At first, it seemed like a small post, just a friend venting her frustration. But in a matter of hours, the story began to spread. People started sharing Carla's post, adding their own commentary. A few influential local activists picked it up, framing it as yet another example of an unjust system at work. The #JusticeForMaria began trending locally, and soon it caught the attention of the broader media. The mainstream press picked up on it as well, but not in the way Maria had expected. Headlines read, "Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist fined in court for minor violation," and "Is the legal system failing its own advocates?" Journalists scrambled to find out more about Maria. They quickly discovered her extensive career in investigative journalism, her work focusing on social justice, racial inequality, and corruption. Maria had been the voice for so many, and yet here she was, facing a routine court case like anyone else, except for many, it didn't seem so routine. Public support swelled, with people questioning how someone of Maria's caliber could be treated so dismissively. Some saw the fine as the tip of an iceberg, a reflection of the systemic problems that affected not just Maria, but many others in similar positions. Others took to online forums to discuss the apparent double standards, with some framing the incident as a glaring example of racial bias within the legal system. But for Maria, the attention was overwhelming. She hadn't expected this kind of uproar. Her work had always spoken for itself, but now she realized it wasn't just about her anymore. This moment had become a symbol for something much bigger, a confrontation with the very system she had spent her career questioning. As the media frenzy grew, Maria began to feel the full weight of it, knowing this wasn't just a minor injustice anymore. It was a moment in time that would force everyone involved, herself included, to face uncomfortable truths. The story of Maria Johnson's court fine took on a life of its own. What started as a small social media post had quickly spiraled into a national conversation. News outlets from across the country were running stories about the fine, each with its own spin. Headlines like "Journalist fined for parking violation," "But she's no ordinary citizen," and "Why a Pulitzer winner is now fighting a minor traffic fine," flooded the internet, piquing the public's curiosity. It wasn't long before the journalists investigating the incident began to dig deeper into Maria's background. They soon uncovered a stunning detail that no one had anticipated. Maria was not just any journalist. She was a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, recognized for her groundbreaking work on racial inequality and social justice. Her reporting had uncovered corruption in local governments, exposed discriminatory practices in education, and given a voice to marginalized communities. She had spent her career challenging systems that perpetuated injustice, all while maintaining a quiet humility that made her one of the most respected figures in journalism. The moment this detail broke, the story shifted entirely. Maria wasn't just an ordinary citizen caught in a trivial legal mishap anymore. She was someone who had spent years exposing the flaws and biases in the very systems she was now a part of. This was no longer about a parking fine. It was about the treatment of a prominent figure, someone who had devoted her life to fighting the very injustices that many claimed to see in her case. The revelation sent shockwaves through the media. Maria's past work quickly became a focal point in the growing discussion. Clips of her interviews, articles, and speeches were shared across social media platforms, showcasing her fierce advocacy for racial justice and fairness. People who had read her pieces in the past now found themselves looking at her in a new light. Was this fine a microcosm of the treatment she had spent her career writing about? Was this incident proof of the systemic biases she had so often exposed? Support for Maria swelled. She became a symbol of the countless others who had faced minor offenses and unfair treatment, unseen, unheard, or dismissed by those in positions of power. Activists, lawyers, and even some of her former colleagues in journalism began calling for a closer examination of the case, questioning whether the fine had been a reflection of something deeper than just a parking violation. While the public rallied behind her, Maria remained largely silent. She had never been one for dramatic statements or media spectacles. She was a woman who preferred to let her work speak for itself, and now, it seemed, that work was being thrust back into the spotlight. Though she understood why people were rallying around her, she knew this wasn't just about her. It was about the larger issues she had been dedicated to for years, the kind of systemic inequalities that continued to persist, often hidden in plain sight. As the media frenzy grew, Judge Hayes, oblivious to Maria's true identity just days before, now found himself at the center of the storm. What had seemed like a straightforward ruling was quickly becoming a public relations nightmare. Judge Martin Hayes sat alone in his office, staring at the stacks of paperwork on his desk. But his mind wasn't on the cases before him. It was on the mounting criticism he had been receiving ever since Maria Johnson's case went viral. The phone had been ringing nonstop, and his inbox was flooded with emails, some supportive, others harshly critical. He had become the center of a media storm, all because of a parking fine. At first, Hayes had brushed it off. He'd done nothing more than his job, applying the law impartially, or so he thought. But as the days wore on, it became clear that this wasn't just about one case. Maria Johnson wasn't just another defendant. She was a respected journalist whose career had centered around exposing injustice, and now she was the face of something much bigger. The case had turned into a lightning rod for conversations about racial inequality, the legal system, and the ways in which the law often fails to account for the lived experiences of those it serves. The backlash wasn't confined to social media. Local activists began organizing protests outside the courthouse, calling for accountability. Hashtags like #JusticeForMaria and #SystemicBias flooded the internet, and news anchors discussed the case in prime time. Articles scrutinized not just the fine itself, but also the way it had been handed down by a judge who had no knowledge of the woman standing before him. Some questioned whether Hayes' ruling had been shaped by unconscious biases, whether the harshness of his decision had been influenced by Maria's race, gender, or even her status as a black woman advocating for social justice. Hayes felt the pressure mount. His reputation, built over decades of serving as a no-nonsense figure in the courtroom, was now in jeopardy. How could he have missed the gravity of the situation? How could he have been so dismissive? He was a judge, sworn to uphold justice, yet here he was, the subject of widespread scorn. The realization hit him hard. His rigid adherence to the letter of the law, without taking into account the context, had failed Maria. It had failed to see the larger story unfolding around her, the very story she had dedicated her life to telling. As the media continued to scrutinize his actions, Judge Hayes began to reflect. He thought back to Maria's calm and collected demeanor in court. She had accepted the fine without protest, but he couldn't help but wonder now if it had been an act of restraint, or an indication of how often people like her had been silenced by a system that didn't see them. He realized, with growing discomfort, that this case was more than a simple legal matter. It was a window into the biases that could exist even within the justice system itself. It wasn't just Maria who had been affected by this decision. It was everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or treated unfairly because of who they were. Judge Hayes knew that his next move would be crucial. Would he continue to hide behind the law, or would he take the opportunity to confront the deeper issues at play? After days of relentless media coverage and mounting criticism, Judge Martin Hayes made a decision that weighed heavily on him. He had always prided himself on upholding the law without exception, but something had shifted. He knew he had made a mistake. He had failed to see the humanity of the woman standing before him in his courtroom, and he was now questioning whether his rigid approach to the law had contributed to the broader injustices he had seen discussed so extensively in the media. One morning, as the weight of the situation pressed down on him, Judge Hayes requested a private meeting with Maria Johnson. He knew it was time to face her. It wasn't just about the fine. It was about something far larger. He had to make amends, even if it was only a small step in a much bigger journey. He wanted to apologize, genuinely and humbly, for his oversight, but more than that, he wanted to understand her perspective, to hear from the woman whose life's work had now become the lens through which his own actions were being re-examined. The meeting took place in his office, away from the spotlight. The walls of the room, once a place where Hayes felt in control, now seemed to close in on him. Maria entered calmly, her posture just as composed as when she had stood before him in court. There was no sign of the anger or frustration that many would have felt in her position. She was just as dignified as ever. "Ms. Johnson," Hayes began, his voice uncharacteristically shaky, "I want to start by apologizing. I've had time to reflect on my actions, and I realize now that I made a mistake. I didn't consider your circumstances, your background, or the impact of my ruling in the way I should have. The law is important, but I see now that fairness requires more than just following the rules. It requires understanding." Maria listened quietly, her expression neutral. She had always been someone who chose her words carefully, and today was no different. "I appreciate your apology, Judge," she said after a long pause. "But I need you to understand that this goes beyond one case, beyond one fine. It's about how people like me, people who are often overlooked or marginalized, are treated by the system. It's about how the law, for all its rules and structure, can sometimes be blind to the reality of those it impacts." Judge Hayes nodded, feeling the weight of her words. For the first time, he was beginning to see the full picture, not just the fine, but the larger system of which he was a part. "You're right," he said. "I've spent so much of my career focusing on the letter of the law that I've forgotten about the spirit of it. I've failed to ask the important questions, the ones that go beyond the case at hand." There was a long silence between them. Maria didn't rush to fill it. She knew that words could only go so far. But she could see something in the judge's eyes that made her believe the apology was sincere. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Maria said softly. "I'm asking for fairness, for all of us." The judge nodded again, his resolve hardening. This moment, this conversation, was the beginning of his own reckoning. He knew it wouldn't be enough to simply apologize. He would have to change, to ensure that his courtroom and his rulings reflected the fairness and empathy that Maria had just described. The hard work was just beginning. The weeks following his private conversation with Maria Johnson were some of the most introspective of Judge Martin Hayes' career. He couldn't shake the gravity of what had transpired. The fine, the media frenzy, and most importantly, the apology he had offered. But it wasn't just the words that stuck with him. It was the realization that the system he had so faithfully served for decades was flawed in ways he had never fully acknowledged. Maria's words haunted him. The law can be blind to the reality of those it impacts. In that simple phrase, she had spoken volumes about the very thing he had taken for granted, that his courtroom had been blind, not just to the individuals who came before him, but to the larger social context that shaped their lives. Maria had seen it for years. She had written about it, fought against it. He had never truly understood it until now. In the days that followed, Hayes made a point to read more of Maria's work. He dug through articles, interviews, and speeches, anything that could give him insight into her perspective. He found himself reading about racial inequality, systemic biases, and how laws that seemed neutral on the surface often weren't. He spent hours poring over her investigation into housing discrimination in the city, her exposes on how the education system failed Black children, and her poignant reflections on the experiences of marginalized communities. Each article challenged him, pushed him to rethink the very principles he had believed in. The more he read, the more he understood how Maria's work had not just been about uncovering injustice, but about challenging people to see the bigger picture. She hadn't just criticized the systems. She had asked for empathy, understanding, and for a recognition of the real human consequences of those systems. Judge Hayes began to change how he approached his work. He took a step back before making rulings, asking himself whether the law in its purest form had considered all perspectives. He spoke to colleagues, opened up about his doubts, and even attended a series of talks about racial bias in the legal system. Slowly but surely, Hayes was developing a new framework for his role. It wasn't enough to simply apply the law. He now felt an ethical responsibility to understand the people who stood before him. He started to show more compassion in his courtroom, particularly with those who were from disadvantaged communities. When defendants explained their circumstances, he made a conscious effort to listen. He even began considering alternatives to fines, opting for community service or other restorative measures when appropriate. He found that the more he took the time to understand, the less he had to rely on blind adherence to rigid rules. Maria had opened his eyes, and now Judge Hayes knew he couldn't go back. The world around him was more complex than he had ever allowed himself to see, and as much as he hated to admit it, he had been part of the very system he had once believed was flawless. He could no longer pretend that the law existed in a vacuum. It existed within a society, and it had to account for the human experiences that shaped it. He had a long way to go, but the first steps had been taken, and that, he knew, was where true change began. Judge Harris sat at his desk the next morning, staring at the letter he had written and then discarded over and over again. He had drafted it several times, each version feeling more inadequate than the last. How do you apologize for something like this? How do you explain that you didn't know the full story? That you had simply made a mistake, one that seemed trivial in the grand scheme of things, but felt like a mountain in his own conscience. He picked up the letter again, reading the simple lines he had managed to write. Dear Ms. Dawson, I regret the decision I made during your court appearance yesterday. In retrospect, I see now that I did not give proper consideration to the context of your case and the person standing before me. I wish to offer my sincerest apologies. It was painfully formal, too detached. It didn't capture the growing sense of responsibility he felt, nor did it reflect the gravity of what he now understood, how his quick and dismissive decision may have added to the many small daily injustices that people like Michelle worked tirelessly to expose. A sigh escaped his lips as he leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. What if Michelle didn't care? What if she saw his apology as nothing more than a hollow gesture, too little, too late? He wondered whether his position as a judge might only make his apology feel even more insincere. After all, how many times had he dismissed people in the past without giving it a second thought? It wasn't just Michelle he had wronged. It was the idea of justice itself. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that he couldn't let this moment pass without taking action. This wasn't just about an apology. It was about acknowledging his own flaws, understanding how his role and his biases affected his decisions, and ensuring that he never made this kind of mistake again. Finally, after what seemed like hours of deliberating, Harris put the pen to paper again. This time, he wrote something more direct, more personal. Dear Ms. Dawson, I owe you an apology. When you stood before me in court yesterday, I did not take the time to understand who you were. I judged you not for your actions, but based on assumptions I didn't even realize I was making. As a judge, I have a responsibility to uphold fairness, and I failed to do that with you. I recognize that now, and I deeply regret my actions. You deserve more than just an apology, but it is all I can offer at this time. I hope you'll accept it, and I would welcome the opportunity to speak with you in person, if you're open to it. Respectfully, Robert Harris. He read the letter over one last time, feeling a mixture of relief and nervousness. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Taking a deep breath, he sealed the envelope and called for it to be sent. Harris could only hope that Michelle would find it in herself to accept it, though he understood that the apology alone might not be enough to undo the harm he had done. As Judge Martin Hayes slowly began to change the way he approached his role, the public continued to watch closely. Maria Johnson's case, while still a topic of national conversation, had begun to fade from the media's constant scrutiny. But the underlying issues it had brought to light, racial bias, systemic inequality, and the limitations of the legal system, remained at the forefront of public discourse. Maria, however, was no longer as focused on the case itself. She had been hesitant at first to take on the role of the symbol for something much bigger than herself, but as the days passed, she realized the impact of her moment in court had far exceeded anything she had anticipated. People were listening. Conversations about racial justice and fairness in the courtroom were taking place in living rooms, at dinner tables, and even in legislative chambers. Her fine had sparked something that could no longer be ignored. But while Maria received an outpouring of support, she also became a target for those who felt her story had been exaggerated. Critics pointed out that a parking fine wasn't the same as the deep injustices she had spent her career exposing. Some even suggested that she was using her platform to make an issue out of a simple mistake, that she had blown it out of proportion to advance her own agenda. Maria wasn't surprised by these criticisms. She had faced detractors throughout her career, people who misrepresented her work, mischaracterized her intentions, and even tried to discredit her entire body of journalism. What troubled her more, however, were the people who had initially rallied behind her, now questioning whether it had been worth the attention. She understood the complexities of using her personal experience as a teaching moment, but the backlash made her wonder, was it too much? Was the attention she had garnered making the conversation more about her than the larger issues? She found herself reflecting on whether this moment had been a brief flash of inspiration or the beginning of something more meaningful. Meanwhile, Judge Hayes was also feeling the weight of the public's attention. As he continued to adjust his practices in court, he noticed that his decisions were under even more scrutiny than before. Activists and community leaders had begun to follow his rulings more closely, and even his colleagues in the legal community were keeping an eye on how he handled future cases. He was aware that every decision he made now had the potential to be seen as a reflection of the lessons he had learned from Maria's case. Despite the increasing pressure, Hayes remained committed to his newfound approach. He had started a series of training sessions for judges and courtroom staff on recognizing implicit biases, and he had even started to meet with local organizations to discuss how the court system could be more responsive to the needs of marginalized communities. Yet he knew the road to true reform was a long one, and there would always be resistance. But he also knew he couldn't turn back now. He had seen the cracks in the system, and he had to keep working toward repairing them. For both Maria and Judge Hayes, the aftermath of the fine had turned into something far greater than either of them had expected. It had become a call to action, a chance to revisit the very core of the justice system and the values it should embody. The question now was not what had happened in the courtroom that day, but what could happen next, and whether the changes they had sparked could create a lasting impact on the way people were treated in courtrooms and in society at large. Months had passed since the initial storm of media attention surrounding Maria Johnson's parking fine, but the ripple effects were still being felt. Judge Martin Hayes continued to adjust to his new understanding of justice, working behind the scenes to transform his courtroom and the way the legal system interacted with the communities it served. Maria, on the other hand, had shifted her focus back to her work, yet the events of the past months had irrevocably changed her perspective on the role of her journalism in shaping the future. Maria had never been one for grand gestures or seeking the spotlight. But as the attention on her case had grown, she realized the true power of her voice, not just in her writing, but in the conversation she had sparked. Her interviews and speeches had evolved from reflections on her career to passionate calls for reform, urging people to engage with the deeper, systemic issues the case had uncovered. The public response, both positive and critical, had propelled the conversation about fairness, accountability, and justice forward in ways she hadn't anticipated. The fine had served as a catalyst, but it was only a starting point. In the months following the controversy, Maria became a frequent speaker at conferences and panels on criminal justice reform, racial equality, and bias in the legal system. While the criticisms had subsided, the real work was just beginning. She was more determined than ever to use her platform to address the inequality she had spent her career covering. The fine had given her a new sense of urgency, a personal connection to the very issues she had written about for so long. She understood more deeply than ever how small, seemingly inconsequential moments could reveal the broader, painful truths of the system. For Judge Hayes, the changes he had made to his courtroom practices were beginning to take root. The training sessions he had initiated for himself and his colleagues had led to discussions on how judges could better address systemic bias in their decisions. Slowly but surely, he began to see the shift in how people appeared before him. Defendants seemed more willing to explain their circumstances openly, and he found himself listening with more empathy than he had before. While his decisions were still based on the law, they were now tempered with a deeper understanding of the people behind the cases. Judge Hayes had also reached out to local community organizations and activist groups to ensure that those who came before him had access to the resources they needed, from legal aid to mental health support. His changes were modest, but they were part of a larger shift in the way the justice system interacted with vulnerable communities. And although resistance still existed, especially from those who believed the system didn't need to change, Hayes found solace in knowing he was doing what was right, moving toward a more just and compassionate approach to the law. In the end, both Maria and Judge Hayes understood that the fight for justice was far from over. The fine had been the spark, but it was the ongoing work of individuals and communities that would fuel lasting change. Maria's case had become a symbol of how even the smallest injustices could have far-reaching consequences, and how, sometimes, it took one moment to start a movement. The road ahead was long, but both Maria and Judge Hayes knew that their efforts, no matter how small, had contributed to creating a more just and understanding world.